Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. I am Ken Coughlin. Thank you very much for joining us. This is now the third part in our 3-week series on topics that have been suggested by our viewers. If you haven't seen the last two, I'd strongly suggest you go back and hit it. We had an episode on facing depression and anxiety. Last week we had we had an episode on the pros and cons of social media. And today we're going to be doing tackling the topic of our science and faith compatible. Before I get to introducing our guests for the day, I do have a couple quick notes I want to mention. Number one, I'm going to push again. If you haven't checked it out yet, check out the new show, Trinity Talk Devotions, that we started here in January on the Trinity Chapter YouTube channel. That is just a weekly 5-minute devotional, similar to what you might get from reading a devotional book, but it's in video form. That goes up every Thursday morning at 7 a.m. Again, you can find it right here on the homepage of the Trinity Joppa channel. Please check that out. Also, if you could, we're making a big push to try to get subscribers up. YouTube is changing some of their functionality. Behind-the-scenes stuff, nothing you're going to notice so much on the channel itself as a viewer, but stuff that we're going to lose out on that's going to make my job managing the channel a little bit more difficult. And we need to get up to 1,000 subscribers in order to get that functionality back. So I'd really appreciate it if you haven't subscribed yet to go ahead and subscribe to the channel and tell your friends, family, and even complete strangers all about it. Ask them to subscribe too. Last thing I'm going to mention, those of you that have been regular viewers of the show have known that, typically speaking, I go through all the little intros at the beginning, and then we start off with a current event segment. We're experimenting with something for a little while. I'm not saying it's always going to be this way, but we are always kind of trying to listen to feedback and tweak things to give you the best experience in the show here that we can. And so we're trying out for a little while where we're going to put the current event segment kind of on the shelf and not do that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The original reason we did the current event segment was to try to keep the show, well, frankly, current, so that people would feel a connection with each weekly episode and have a reason to want to tune in this particular week. One thing we're finding, though, is if you put an episode out there, like take last week's episode, it was titled The Pros and Cons of Social Media. However, we didn't really start talking about social media until 10 minutes into the show. Obviously, if someone's tuning into a program to learn about social media and nobody's talking about it right away, they might not want to hang around until they do. So we're changing that up so we can kind of spend more time on the topic of the week and dive into it more quickly. So, that being said, that's the preliminaries are out of the way. Let me go ahead and introduce our guests for the day. I am going to start, let me see. I'm going to start to my left. I'm going to start with Kelly here. To my left is Kelly Derwart. Kelly is the mother of 2 children. She is married to some stranger named Greg that I've never met, I don't think. So, no, Greg's been on the show quite a bit, and Greg's a great guy. She and her family have been members here at Trinity for about 7 years. She works part-time at a bank, and she has a degree in archaeology. Welcome very much. Thank you for coming, Kelly.
Thank you.
And seated over, the mics are good, but not that good. You got to speak.
Okay, thank you.
And seated over here to my right is Josh Alexander. Josh received his undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins in physics and mathematics, and his master's degree in science and religion from Biola University in California. He currently works full-time in the Registrar's Office of American Public University System. He is on the worship team at Oakland Methodist Church, where he also teaches adult Sunday school classes and periodically teaches classes on apologetics. He is a chapter director for Ratio Christi, a campus apologetics alliance focused on helping students and professors understand what they believe and to make a winsome case for why they believe it. He lives with his wife Rachel and his son Triskel in Berkeley County, West Virginia. Welcome very much. Thank you for coming, Josh.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
So, without the current event segment, that means we are ready to start writing more topic of the week. What do you say?
Sounds good.
All right, so our topic for the week this week is, are science and faith compatible? And I want to start out kind of talking about the issue kind of generally, and then hopefully we'll have time to get into some specifics as well. But what I want to do for starters, I want to read 4 quotes. And these are quotes from 4 different people with 4, maybe, shall we say, different perspectives on what is the relationship between science and religion. And the first one is probably the most colorful one, and this comes from new atheist Rickard Dawkins. And here's what Professor Dawkins had to say. He said, "Religion in science is not just redundant and irrelevant. It's an active and pernicious charlatan. It peddles false explanations, or at least pseudo-explanations, where real explanations could have been offered and will be offered. Pseudo-explanations that get in the way of the enterprise of discovering real explanations. As the centuries go by, religion has less and less room to exist and perform its obscurantist interference with the search for truth. He likes big words, I'll give him that. In the 21st century, it's high time finally to send it packing. Moving down, slightly down, I guess, the ladder of verbosity and flair, we'll go with Stephen Jay Gould. Now, Stephen Jay Gould was an agnostic scientist, and here's what he had to say about it. He said, each subject has a legitimate magisterium, or domain of teaching authority, and these magisteria do not overlap. The principle that I would like to designate, he designates as noma, or non-overlapping magisteria. The net of science covers the empirical universe, what it is made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory. The net of religion extends over questions of moral meaning and value. These two magisteria do not overlap. Next, what I want to do is a quote from the actual website of the National Academy of Sciences that I looked up just over the weekend, and here's how they explain the relationship between science and religion. They say science and religion are based on different aspects of human experience. In science, explanations must be based on evidence drawn from examining the natural world. Scientifically based observations or experiments that conflict with an explanation eventually must lead to modification or even abandonment of that explanation. Religious faith, in contrast, does not depend only on empirical evidence, is not necessarily modified in the face of conflicting evidence, and typically involves supernatural forces or entities. Because they are not a part of nature, supernatural entities cannot be investigated by science. In this sense, science and religion are separate and address aspects of human understanding in different ways. Attempts to pit science and religion against each other create controversy where none needs to exist. So you can see we're kind of moving down the scale here. You compare that statement to Dawkins. It's maybe we may take some issue with that statement still, but it's certainly not Dawkins' statements. Yeah. But last but not least, let's take a quote from a gentleman named Paul. Wrote a book called Romans. And here's what he had to say about it. He said, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So, I'm going to throw up a softball one, first of all. Of those four explanations, which one do you accept?
Well, I side with Paul.
You're going to go with Paul?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Paul.
All right, no, seriously. What I want to start out with is, looking at those explanations. If you want to say something specifically about one of those, that's fine. Or just in general, what is the relationship between science and we can't talk about religion entirely. It's only a 30-minute show, but sure. Let's talk specifically about Christianity. What do you see about the relationship between science and Christianity?
Well, just to preface some of my remarks here, I think it's interesting. I generally use a fourfold methodology or four categories to sort all of these different ways of relating science and religion. And actually, you chose a quote that kind of really represented each of the four schools that I ended up seeing. And
we didn't compare notes ahead of time.
No, we didn't. No. So we have conflict. Then they all start with C. You've got conflict with Rickard Dawkins. And then you have, with Stephen Jay Gould, you have compartmentalization, where they never overlap. They not only talk about different sorts of things, but they talk about different aspects of different sorts of things. And then you have more of a, we're willing to allow them to converse. So we call that conversation from the National Academy of Sciences, where they can talk about maybe sometimes the same things, but from different angles, so that they can't possibly, they can't really be in controversy or be in conflict with one another. But they can sometimes deal with, like biology looks at the human and religion looks at the human too, but totally different aspects, right? And sometimes you can compare methodologies like that quote was doing, where it says, here's how religion works and here's how science works. And it's comparing the methodologies, but it's saying, well, there is a methodology of sorts. And then finally, Paul, I think, this is where I fall, is the convergence, which is to say not that there's never any apparent conflict, not that there aren't areas that don't overlap, but that science, when it's done well, is going to, it has to point to the creator. If, from a Christian perspective, we can't, the same person who created is the person who revealed himself in Scripture. And so we would expect to find a convergence of the two, as they put it, the two books of, the book of nature and the book of the Bible, to converge. So
yeah, I like the point you're making. So it's not that they're completely the same realm. They have a certain both both go off into topics that they don't necessarily overlap on, but they do overlap on an awful lot. Kelly, what do you think about I'm very interested in your point of view because of the background you come from, where you did work as an archaeologist for a while. And so I'm curious about, back when you were doing that, what was your view about the relationship between science and religion, and what is it today?
Well, when I was doing that, I wasn't strong in my faith, so I think that it did matter. I just sort of whatever they told me, and wasn't it was just scientific evolution or just the basic general things that they taught. And so my faith at that point wasn't an issue until later on when I wasn't doing archaeology, and then it was sort of challenging how to fit those together. And so then I was sort of trying to find other sources and things that made more sense.
I don't know. In my experience, I've come across a lot of people who's like, they almost want to mentally avoid the subject. Yeah. They just like, okay, well, I'm going to believe what this scientist over here is telling me, and I'm also going to believe what my pastor over here is telling me, maybe. But they never really look at them together.
Never mix. And that's why I think that type of person that, and I tend to be not very conflict averse, but I think that some of us just don't like the fighting and the conflict, and it's hard to wrestle and resolve that tension. And so it makes it very more comfortable, I think, to compartmentalize and to keep them apart and say, well, look, there's peace through separation, right? That's the way I think people look at it a little bit. And I can sympathize, because it does get tiring after a while to feel like, okay, there's constantly a tension here, especially if you're under fire. And so it sounds like you weren't under fire. Your faith wasn't such that it was something that had to be connected to the science at early stages of your life. And then what happened was there was kind of a crossfade, I guess, is that there, where one's building and the other's kind of lessening. Is that accurate? Or?
Yeah, right.
So another interesting thing I find when I look at these four approaches to the relationship between science and religion, it asks the question of, well, what is science? And I pulled a definition from a website called Live Science, or livescience.com. And they say science is a systematic and logical approach to discovering how things in the universe work. It is also the body of knowledge accumulated through the discoveries about all the things in the universe. When conducting research, scientists use the scientific method to collect measurable, empirical evidence in an experiment related to a hypothesis, often in the form of an if-then statement, that the result aiming to support or contradict a theory. It's the last part that grabs my attention, because I think a lot of people, when they talk about science, they almost limit it to the use of the scientific method.
It's like a laboratory kind of picture of things, right? Where you're a chemist in the lab and you've got, okay, well, if I mix this with this, and then I'm going to get this exact result. And one of the things, especially, thinking about archaeology, it's like, well, what about the historical sciences? How do you integrate those in, and some of the other sciences that are not necessarily like lab sciences, right?
Is archaeology a science?
I think so.
I also question, if you're limiting science, or the definition of science, to this use of the scientific method, why are you doing that? I mean, we have a whole field called social sciences. I mean, It's got science in the name. So at some point, somebody must have thought there was something scientific about these pursuits.
Right.
And what I find is a lot of people who try to limit it to the scientific method, I've had people come and try to convince me that, well, all meaningful knowledge can be derived from science.
Right.
Really? Can that statement in and of itself be derived from your definition of what science is?
Exactly. Yeah. And you're limiting the definition of science. And I was thinking, okay, so science originally, like the Latin term that we had, just meant knowledge. So is all of our human knowledge and everything we know, I mean, we can say, yeah, scientism, this idea that all knowledge has to be derived from science, well, that's kind of like, it seems a little bit self-defeating. But at the same time, I think we can look at lots of things that we do know that we definitely didn't figure out using a scientific method per se. That's like, we know our internal thoughts and feelings, or we know any number of things from everyday experience. So I kind of tend to view science as being a composite of a bunch of sort of best practices for how you would learn about different topics, and sometimes the method is going to differ depending on the field, right? If you want to learn about chemistry, well, then you've got to have a certain set of tools and a certain set of practices in the scientific method, right? but you want to learn about something that happened historically, we're going to have different methods, different tools entirely. And so I think that you can kind of take a little bit more eclectic approach. That's what I tend to do, is say, okay, I'm not really so much interested in knowing whether I'm following a particular method as I am in knowing whether the method that I am following is going to guide me to true knowledge.
And isn't that what the goal should be? I mean, I kind of think like, well, wait a minute. So you're telling me that I have to use the scientific method to find out, well, what if the scientific method is not equipped? I mean, the classic example is, let's talk about, one of those quotes said that, the supernatural is by definition not, subject to scientific investigation. I don't entirely agree with that statement. I'll get to that in a second. Mm-hmm. But even assuming that's correct, all right, well, then if you're limiting yourself to knowledge through just science of the scientific method, what if there is a supernatural out there? You're basically saying, well, I'm going to set the game in such a way that I'm never going to find out whether that's the true answer or not. And the reason I'm saying that I don't necessarily completely agree with that statement is, let's take, what do we talk about when we say the supernatural? Well, in our case as Christians, we're talking about God. Right. Who is God? God is a person, right? Mm-hmm. God has an intelligence. God communicates through his word or what have you. And it's like, well, does that mean, sure, if I'm dealing with an intelligent agent, maybe I can't expose an intelligent agent to the scientific method in the purest sense, because scientific method requires reproducibility, and you can freely choose whether to act in a certain way or not.
Right.
But there are still ways that we test for the presence of intelligence. Kelly, you and I were talking before we went on the air about alien life, and there are ways that people test for alien life. Wouldn't, in theory anyway, if we can look for signs of intelligence out there, shouldn't we also be able to look for signs of intelligence in our own world?
People won't give God the credit. They'll just say that, well, there's Martians somewhere else that gave us intelligence, or the information for all of life.
For starting the order.
They're willing they're willing to recognize an intelligence is operating there, but then they're not crediting God with what you're saying. Right. And to some extent, but if they're willing to do that, then you say, well, if we're allowed to credit an intelligence, who needs to some extent, you don't need to speculate. You don't need to say, well, there's supernatural and there's natural, and we can't ever test for it. It sounds like that's what you were saying, right? Is that we don't need to worry about whether it's natural or supernatural if we know how to recognize intelligence, and there's signs of intelligence in our, say, for example, DNA, then, well, maybe we were designed by aliens.
Well, maybe your aliens. The origin of life is another one. That's what we were actually talking about. The origin of life issue comes up lots of times, where it's like, well, even if we assume, for the sake of argument, that macroevolutionary theory is correct, which we might get into that in a little bit, but even if we assume, for the sake of argument, that it's completely correct, it still doesn't answer the question of how it all got started. I mean, evolution is a process that requires pre-existing material to act upon. Well, how did life first begin? And one of the explanations, I think it was Rickard Dawkins, actually, that I saw in an interview a while ago, where he was saying, oh, well, I think it maybe life came on some meteor that crashed here to Earth. And it's like, well, all you're doing is you're moving the question up one level. Well, now the question is, well, okay, then how did life get started on that other place, or in the meteor, wherever it came from?
And there it was ideal, of course. Wherever that other place was just perfect. Right. Yeah, panspermia, right?
Yeah. Well, a term that I want to bring up is, we've kind of been dancing around here a little bit, is a term is called scientism. Mm-hmm. And the scientism, this is a definition from the Pocket Dictionary of Apologetics and Philosophy of Religion. It says, scientism is the conviction that scientific knowledge, particularly that derived from the natural sciences, is the highest or even only form of knowledge. Scientism thus depreciates the possibility that ultimate truth can be derived from such areas as moral, aesthetic, and religious experience, and it typically rejects the idea that truth can be derived from special revelation. I mean, the long and short of it, scientism is basically the belief that science is the way to knowledge, and really, and sometimes the only way to knowledge. And I think that lots of times, if you're out there and you're getting confronted by somebody who's saying that, well, religion or Christianity is anti-science, lots of times that's what I find is underlying it, is this belief that science in and of itself is really the only true way that you should be discovering anything. leaving aside the obvious question, well, that statement in and of itself can't be proved by science. So you're a self-defeating. It's a self-defeating argument.
And in being anti-science, then you're pro-ignorance, and then we have people like Peter Boghossian who are saying, well, faith is pretending to know what you don't really know. And then, of course, it's like, yeah, that's what I do all the time. That's why I'm here, because I like pretending.
Yeah. Well, that amazes me too. Sometimes how people on the outside will define faith in a way that suits their needs. It's like, wait a minute, if you want to know what a Christian means by faith, here's an idea. Ask a Christian, But you see it all the time. People talk about, blind faith. And faith, I've seen people define it as, faith is belief contrary to evidence or something like that. Right. It's like, that's what you need. You don't have faith unless all the evidence is pointing out that you're wrong and you still stubbornly believe it. Then you have faith. Anything other than that, you don't have faith. Yeah. Well, why don't we try to maybe give a few examples here? Because I think we've talked very generally about whether Christianity is consistent with science or not, or these four different viewpoints of it. And our position, I think, is that it's overlapping. What was the C term you used?
Convergence.
Convergence. Yeah. All right. So I want to give maybe in our closing minutes here the audience some examples of what we mean by that. I've got a few, but we don't have to go with them. If anybody else has something else you wanted to bring up.
Well, I like the examples that I happen to have seen the examples that you're
going to steal my examples.
I'm not going to steal. No, I'm going to try not to steal your examples now. But I like the examples that you had, and because I had a background in physics, and so we'll see those. I think really one of the things I like when we're speaking as a Christian, I like just looking at. I like looking at Jesus and the way he approached things and the rational method and the lack of. Just believe. He doesn't give that kind of answer. He gives reasons. He gives arguments. He handles the hot seat expertly, and so that's one point I'd count against this idea of faith as blind belief. But as far as examples of convergence, then since you are already mentioning some stuff about the fine tuning, but I like the Big Bang. As a possible area of convergence, because what astronomers for many years thought was that there was no beginning to the universe, and so consequently, the Christian was like, okay, you're in conflict with science because the universe had no beginning, but the Bible says it had a beginning, and that has changed dramatically. And the scientific evidence came out in the 20th century, throughout the 20th century, that the universe had a beginning, and so that actually. Was a big area of convergence that's been capitalized on, as you know, by like William Lane Craig being the big popularizer of one of the cosmological arguments. That's really my favorite. That's the one that got me through college, because I'm just like this lone Christian at a secular university where even the other Christians weren't really like into this whole defend your faith. They were just kind of like just get through college and don't really worry about intellectual conflict about it. But that's what helped me was saying, okay, if anything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence, and the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its existence outside of itself, right? That was a big one for me. So that's the one I would use as a primary example.
Kelly, let me ask you about this. So you homeschooled your two daughters, correct?
Correct.
Now, at some point, I'm guessing that the topic of evolution came up.
It did.
How did you handle that?
Well, I was excited to tell them about evolution, at that time. And they were asking me if that was Adam and Eve. And I was like, oh, I don't know, And then how does that fit in the, evolutionary, where does that fit? And so that led me to sort of research more, find some resources. Answers in Genesis was a good organization that I found so that I could equip them to defend their faith.
So it made you kind of do your own investigation.
Right. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. And people don't do that nowadays. It's like, why don't people think for themselves? I have conversations with people all the time that say, Christians don't believe in evolution. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I'm a big advocate of Greg Koukl. Greg Koukl has a book called Tactics, where he teaches people, how to interact with others about their faith. And one of the first questions he always tells people that you need to ask is, well, what do you mean by that? And so when I, people come and say, well, Christians don't believe in evolution, I think that's a great first question. Well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by evolution? Yeah. Because there's a number of different ways you could take that term. If you're just referring to, change over time, just in a general sense, I don't know anybody that doesn't believe in evolution, because I got news for you. I weigh a lot more now than I did 2 years ago. I've changed over time, all right? I've evolved, all right? Then if you're looking at it, the other way you can look at it is, well, on a microevolutionary scale. Within a given species, are there biological changes that occur based upon, adapting to the environment? Right. Most Christians will say yes. They don't have a problem with that.
Even young Earth creationists, yeah, absolutely.
Because nobody has an issue. And that gets back to, Darwin's finches and everything. I'm not going to go into that whole experiment now, but that's basically what all that showed was, at the beginning and the end of Darwin's investigation, a finch was still a finch, okay? Right. And then, of course, the next way you can look at it is macroevolution, which is where, a finch becomes something else. And that's a different matter entirely. And I find that, people, when they're looking at that, you've got the intelligent design movement that's put out by the Discovery Institute, for example, some leading proponents of that. And I think people are just so quick to dismiss it as saying, oh, it's just religion, therefore it's wrong. Let's not even bother to look at the credentials of the people that are advocating for this. But I look at it and say, look, even if you don't want to take the step to the intelligent designer, when I look at these intelligent design arguments or these creationist arguments, there's two parts of them. There's what I call the defensive part of them and the offensive part of them. In other words, they'll point out defensively problems with macroevolutionary theory. And then offensively, they'll present their viewpoint that they believe the explanation is the presence of intelligent designer. Even if you don't take that offensive side of it, though, don't discount the defensive side of it, because it's still pointing out that there are some issues, like Stephen Meyer, and this is one of the ones I had in my notes we were going to mention. Stephen Meyer wrote an article in 2004 that was published in the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, a whole big hubbub about it getting peer-reviewed and published. Won't go into all that right now. But in a nutshell, what he was challenging was saying, hey, look, macroevolutionary theory has a problem because when you have new forms, novel animal forms develop, that requires an infusion of new DNA, new information. And he was basically pointing out that macroevolutionary theory really doesn't have a satisfactory answer where new information comes from. Change existing information, maybe, but where do you generate this new information from? And now, of course, his article went on to suggest the presence of an intelligent designer behind it. But it's but even if you don't want to take it to that step, why are people so stubborn in refusing to listen to criticisms of the evolutionary viewpoint? I mean, I'm going to assume that you have the answer to that, Josh.
Oh, yeah. I hesitate to speculate because there's different levels of explanation for that. And sometimes I think they honestly, they believe that there really is, that it's unassailable. That evolution is unassailable. And then other times I think it's more psychological of, this is the only game in town. I mean, when you look at it from an atheist perspective, you have to. There's no other option. And so if you're finding the only option that you have for remaining an atheist challenge, then, because you can't be an atheist if you want to say even theistic evolution, because there's theism right there in the beginning. So that's a psychological component. But I know that there are people that just honestly believe that we're making bad arguments or that they're making good arguments. And so I try to be gracious when I encounter that, because it is mainly because I want to follow Jesus's example, of treating other people the way I want to be treated. And so, but I do think there is that component of, this is the only game in town.
It's kind of backed into a corner.
Backed into a corner. And then there are some that honestly believe that it's not necessarily the only game in town, but that everything will be threatened about, for example, science. Like, well, okay, if we let the divine, foot in the door, right, then we're going to have a problem, because then people are going to start citing God as an explanation for everything. I think Rickard Dawkins mentioned that, right? Where he's talking about these fake explanations that
God of the gaps.
Yeah, God of the gaps and things like that. Well, we don't know.
Science of the gaps.
Science, exactly. Naturalism of the gaps. Well, we don't know how naturalism accomplished this, or we don't know how this got here. But it had to have been that, right?
Right. All right, so we're going to take a quick poll around the table, because we got to sign off here. We're already running out. Okay, so here it is. Science and Christianity, are they incompatible? Can somebody be a intellectually, scientifically satisfied Christian?
Yes.
What do you think?
So they're not incompatible. I definitely think that you can be a scientifically fulfilled Christian, I guess you could say, or an intellectually fulfilled Christian. I think that's important, and I think we're called to that as Christians. We should expect that, right? Love the Lord your God with all your mind is part of Christianity. It's not the only part of Christianity, but it's an important part. So that would be my answer.
All right. Well, hopefully we said something here that's going to help some people out there today. Again, it's a short show, so we can't go into every single argument, everything out there. But I think more than anything, the point here was just to show that, look, lots of times when people are challenging your faith, your Christian faith, by saying it's incompatible with science, that's coming from a perspective of perhaps scientism, or perhaps the idea of being backed in a corner like Josh was talking about here. And not necessarily coming from a perspective of rational evaluation of the evidence and of the arguments. There are plenty of Christians out there who are scientists, who are scientifically minded, who believe differently than naturalists do. And there should be a world where we should be free to discuss those differences of opinion freely, and try to pursue what the true answer really is, whether that's an answer that's achievable through the scientific method or through some other means. So thank you very much for tuning in. If you like this video, do us a favor. If you could, please go ahead and click the like button. There's a thumbs up button right here on the YouTube page. Also, if you could, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Trinity Talk Live does have its own Facebook page as well. It's at Trinity Talk Live Podcast. You can give us a like on there. We'd really appreciate that. And that's also a place where you can use to give us feedback. Like I said, the last 3 weeks we've covered topics that viewers have suggested. And that Facebook page is a good way for you to suggest a topic for a future episode of that, if you have something on your mind you'd like to hear us talk about. Next week, you've got to tune in next week. I'm making you a promise right now. Next week will be the most adorable show we have ever done. All right, now, have you heard the phrase that kids say the darndest things? Well, they do. And sometimes they also ask the best questions. What we did a couple weeks ago is we actually went around to our Sunday school classes here at Trinity, and we asked a couple of the kids if anybody wanted to come on camera, if they had any questions they wanted to ask Pastor Chuck, who's our lead pastor at the moment. And it could be anything about Jesus, his life, the church, our physical church building, anything they wanted to ask. And a few of them actually did want to come on camera. Well, a lot of them wanted to come on camera, but a few of them actually wanted to come on and actually ask questions. And so we filmed them asking their questions. We passed those along to Pastor Chuck. And next week, Pastor Chuck is going to be on the show, and he's going to answer those questions for those children. You are going to be shocked and surprised. The questions range from everything. There are the ones that are going to make you laugh. There are questions that are going to make you cry. And there are definitely questions, believe it or not, that are going to make you think. That's a promise. All right? So please be sure to join us next week. One last opportunity here for me to thank our guests for today. Thank you very much, Kelly Derwart, for coming on the show. Kelly, now that the whole family's been on, and so I made her a promise, since the whole family's been on, they earned the mug. She gets to take home the mug. So, thank you very much, Josh.
My pleasure.
Josh drove here from West Virginia, so Josh gets to take home the mug as well. So, and thank you all very much for tuning in. See you next week. God bless.
In your word we will follow.
They are a small grassroots team of apologetics speakers, each of whom has their own small grassroots ministry. Then one day they had an idea. It started almost as a joke, but quickly ballooned into a full-fledged ministry plan. Gathered together as bloggers, podcasters, vloggers, and writers, each with their own small voice, but drowned out and passed over by the grandeur of celebrity apologists. From the eastern seaboard to the west coast and various locations in between, they come from different backgrounds, but they share one great message. This journey of these thinkers, each with his own small influence in some small corner of the Christian apologetics world, will finally converge in one location. They will meet one another for the very first time. This is a team of speakers like no other. Among them is a man who has struggled against seizures and brain surgery, and yet has remained brilliant in his defense of the gospel. A former atheist whose conversion to Christianity now has him battling the worldview he once held. A former gospel rapper whose ministry on behalf of urban believers fights for racial reconciliation. An elementary school teacher who strives to make apologetics accessible to the everyman. And finally, a man with Asperger's syndrome married to a woman with Asperger's syndrome. His passion, along with apologetics, is to keep the church informed on matters of how to minister to the autistic brothers and sisters in their midst. and of the treasure that his unconventional marriage has been to him. In May of 2018, the group, now known as the Mentionables, will hold its very first national conference in Greensboro, North Carolina. This unusual group, the Mentionables, which came together almost by accident, now invite you to join them. Come see their messages united. Come see what small voices can do to present one loud noise for the kingdom. Join us for Mentionable, the Conference 2018. For more information, visit the Mentionables Facebook group page or contact Greensboro Christian Church at 336-621-5226. Mentionable, the Conference. Many small voices present one big message.